Chapter 9. China, the New Global Superpower. When our thousands of Chinese students abroad return home, you will see how China will transform itself. Deng Xiaoping. Choose a job you love, and you will never have to work a day in your life. Confucius. China's evolution from a third-world nation to an economic superpower in record time has been an amazing metamorphosis. Every aspect of the global economy is now affected by the rapid emergence of China as it quickly became a global powerhouse. China is a nation of 1.3 billion people, and its leaders have used authoritarian communism to harness the power of capitalism. The rise of China marks the beginning of a great transformation in the modern era, and its emergence brings new challenges and opportunities to the global economy of the 21st century. China should be considered a civilization state and not a nation state. The political and philosophical unity of the country is based on a strong sense of civilization among its people. It is the world's oldest living and continuous, sustained civilization, and the first to re-emerge as a dynamic power in the modern era. Chinese people throughout the world continue to practice and promote the deep aspects of their civilization. Historical Review. The ancient history of China spans over 5,000 years, and the written history goes back over 4,000 years with many dynastic eras. It has managed to survive intact as a unified nation for over 2,200 years. Over a period of many centuries, Japan, Korea, and other Asian nations borrowed from Chinese art, language, literature, religion, and technology. The major philosophical teachings of Confucianism, Taoism, and the yin-yang principle have influenced the thinking of many generations of people throughout the entire world. In science, technology, and other areas of development, China has pioneered in traditional Chinese medicine and acupuncture, chemistry and alchemy, government systems, weapons and systems of warfare, development of paper, the compass, gunpowder, first discovered and used in China during the Han Dynasty, 2006 BC to 220 AD, fireworks, the first prototype of a printing press with movable type, abacus, umbrellas, kites, silk cloth, and porcelain. When we look at the period of ancient history that gave birth to a unified China, we see that separate kingdoms endured centuries of warfare to achieve the genesis of a unified civilization. It was under the leadership and autocratic rule of Emperor Qin Shi Huang, 259 BC to 201 BC, the first emperor of China, that the seven warring states or seven kingdoms, Qin, Qi, Chu, Yan, Han, Zhao, and Wei, were unified to form one great Chinese empire, solidifying the boundaries of what is considered modern-day China. After hundreds of years of warfare, a unified Chinese nation was born. Today, on display in Beijing, is the over 8,000 life-size terracotta warriors, horses, chariots, and other artifacts commemorating the powerful army. History tells us that Emperor Qin had an army of over 1 million men, used to unify this great nation. It was Emperor Qin who commissioned the building of the Great Wall of China. After the War of Unification, the emperor institutionalized unity throughout the kingdom. He instituted the following main decrees. A decree to consolidate a system of weights and measures. Currency reforms. The use of a unified system of copper coins throughout the kingdom. A standardized writing system for the entire nation. Legend has it that prior to his death, Emperor Qin was in search of immortality. It appears that he achieved that goal in the name and longevity of the nation he forged into a unified whole, China. The 20th century. After the global defeat of Japan that brought World War II to a close and severed Japan's grip on mainland China and Taiwan, there began, between 1945 and 1947, an intense struggle and battle. The Chinese Civil War fought for the supremacy of the mainland between the Communists under Chairman Mao Zedong, December 26, 1893 through September 9, 1976, and the Nationalists under General Chiang Kai-shek, October 31, 1887 through April 5, 1975. The Communists emerged victorious and forced Chiang Kai-shek and the Nationalists, the Republic of China, ROC, onto the island of Taiwan, historically known as Formosa. In 1949, the Communist Party came to power and established the People's Republic of China, PRC, under Chairman Mao Zedong. Under Chairman Mao, Orthodox Chinese communism was instituted and practiced for over 3 decades. After Chairman Mao's death in 1976, change began to take root in the communist system in the personage of Deng Xiaoping. Deng Xiaoping, August 22, 1904 through February 19, 1997, was the chief reformer and architect who led China towards a market economy. He served as the paramount leader of the People's Republic of China from 1978 to 1992. His radical reforms, policies, and directives were revolutionary and were often opposed by hardliners in the Communist Party who viewed Deng as a capitalist sympathizer. During Mao's Cultural Revolution, Deng was purged twice from the party because of his views. However, in the end, he managed to outmaneuver his opponents and rise to prominence and power in the Communist Party. He spearheaded China's capitalist revolution and was considered the architect of a new brand of socialist thinking. His vision for Communist China was a road to free markets and away from central planning that did not take into consideration market forces. Deng envisioned China as a socialist market economy. He began his era of reforms in 1978 and believed that it would take 20 years to catch up with the West. Thus, in the early stages of his revolutionary reforms, China was opened to foreign investment and the global market and to limited private competition. No doubt, Deng Xiaoping must have been impressed and or influenced by the rapid economic growth and technological advances that took place in Taiwan, Japan, and other Asian tigers over the decades since the start of the Communist Revolution in 1949. Deng took the ultimate risk as a Communist Party member, a much more profound movement than Gorbachev and Perestroika, the restructure and reform of the Soviet economy and political system by seeking to introduce the advances of the West into the command structure of the communist model. To some extent, this was economic heresy and a sharp departure from the Communist Party line. However, Deng, like the Soviets, would come to understand years later, realized that in the years since World War II, capitalistic societies had created a higher standard of living for the majority of its working-class people, in contrast to their communist counterparts. People in Western nations did not wait in long lines for hours in order to purchase basic necessities or luxury items. They had access to distribution networks that were more sophisticated and efficient in delivering goods to the public. Deng wanted this, as well as the scientific and technological advances in the West for mainland China and its people. His goal was to ensure that the PRC would be an advanced economic, scientific, technological, and military powerhouse before the end of the 20th century. Deng's first series of reforms focused on China's rural economy. This would be socialism with Chinese characteristics. Deng introduced the doctrine of the 4 modernizations: the reformation of agriculture, industry, science and technology, and the military. An initial push was to establish village entrepreneurs and entrepreneurship inside China. The success of the rural reforms provided self-sufficiency to millions of farmers. By 1981, the farmers were feeding themselves. In 1972, President Richard M. Nixon became the first sitting U.S. president to officially visit mainland China. From February 21st through the 28th of 1972, Nixon traveled to Beijing, Hangzhou, and Shanghai, met with Chairman Mao, and began the process of normalizing relationships between the two nations. This event ended 25 years of separation between China and America. It was also in that same year that China became a member of the United Nations. And in 1978, under President Jimmy Carter, a new era of Sino-U.S. normalized relations began. After negotiating for over a year, and with the U.S. agreement to officially sever its diplomatic and military arrangements with Taiwan, a joint communique on the establishment of diplomatic relations between the People's Republic of China and the United States of America came into existence on December 16, 1978. In 1979, the U.S. recognized diplomatic relations with mainland China. The embassy in Taiwan was closed and replaced with a new embassy in Beijing. To solidify these new arrangements with the United States, Deng Xiaoping became the first communist leader to visit America since China's revolution began in 1949. At the invitation of President Carter, the then Chinese Vice Premier, Deng Xiaoping, visited the United States from January 29 through February 4, 1979. This was a very important diplomatic mission and was one of the most historic events of the 20th century. Deng Xiaoping made it clear that China's top priorities were economic and technological development, so his time in the U.S. included visits to the headquarters of Coca-Cola in Atlanta, Boeing in Seattle, and the Johnson Space Center in Houston. This was prime time for China to begin the process of establishing a new economic, technological, and scientific paradigm for a third world nation seeking to move aggressively into the modern era. For Deng, it was time for China's economic and technological rise in the world. New economic model for China. By opening the relationship with the West, the door was now open to start receiving the technology and scientific development of the West that Deng knew China needed. 4 major coastal economic zones were opened in China to begin the process of economic development and market reforms. The initial focus was infrastructure, roads, ports, factories, and manufacturing. In time, the coastal economic zones were expanded to include many more zones, and the open door policy was in full operation. It was also in 1979 that Deng Xiaoping initiated China's one-child policy, which was designed to limit the nation's population growth. Initially, it was to be a temporary measure. However, as of 2012, the policy was still in place. Under the Sino-British Joint Declaration signed on December 19, 1984, the United Kingdom agreed to return Hong Kong to China in 1997. Similarly, Portugal agreed in 1987 to return Macau to China in 1999 under similar conditions as the British deal. The political and economic model employed was one country, two systems. The agreements decreed that both Hong Kong and Macau would continue to operate as bastions of capitalism unchanged for 50 years after the communist takeover. This essentially meant the coexistence of one political system in control of a different economic system, the coexistence of a communist political system and a market-driven capitalistic system. The 1980s would also witness a robust period of private enterprise. The standard of living for hundreds of millions of people was raised on an unprecedented scale. This all happened after the reforms and opening up of China's markets. In 1988, Deng's next level of reforms removed government control over prices, allowing for market forces to take root in mainland China. Following the sudden death of Hu Yaobang, a respected leading reformer, who died of a sudden heart attack on April 15, 1989, students began gathering near Tiananmen Square in a strong response to his passing. The size of the gatherings grew as students began to protest and state their grievances over corruption of the party elite, limited career prospects, rising inflation, and a push for continued economic reforms and liberalization, as well as freedom of the press. The discontent of students and the galvanizing movement of 1 million Chinese people of Tiananmen Square and other parts of China became symbolic of a communist regime in crisis. Government restraint held steady until the June 4th affair witnessed the People's Liberation Army clearing Tiananmen Square of the protesters. Many people died and thousands were injured as widespread international condemnation of the government's use of force against the protesters became a mass media event. Western governments imposed economic sanctions and arms embargoes in response to the massacre. The market reform movement of Deng Xiaoping suffered badly from the Tiananmen Square events. This was a major defeat and a setback for his economic ideals for China. In a move to maintain his political survival, Deng was forced into making concessions with socialist hardliners that remained firmly opposed to his market reform policies. By the end of 1989, Deng Xiaoping chose to formally resign from the government. Thus, market reforms were halted as the Communist Party adopted a more conservative economic agenda intended to slow the rapid changes initiated by Deng Xiaoping's reform policies. For 2 to 3 years, the market reform movement was in limbo. In the interim, events in other parts of the communist world would ultimately influence policy shifts within China's communist regime. The global communist movement was in complete turmoil. The collapse of Eastern European communism during the closing months of 1989 became the catalyst for the independence movements inside the Soviet Union. Ethnic and nationalistic yearnings began pouring out of many of the empire's 15 republics, particularly the Baltic republics of Lithuania, Latvia, and Estonia. Thus, the Soviet Union stood at the crossroads in 1989, transforming and being transformed by the mega events happening inside and outside the nation. By mid-1990, the unthinkable happened. The largest, most prosperous republics were declaring independence and moving towards the creation of sovereign states. Lithuania, March 1990. Estonia, March 1990. Latvia, May 1990. Uzbekistan, June 1990. And Ukraine, July 1990. By November 1990, it was clear to many astute observers that the Soviet Union was in an economic depression. Ration coupons were issued and used in many cities throughout the nation. By 1991, some 74 years after its founding by Vladimir Ilyich Lenin, 1870 through 1924, and the Bolshevik Party in the 1917 Russian Revolution, the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics had collapsed from the massive weight and financial burden of the arms struggle, the inefficiencies of socialist command-style economic model, and an internal Great Depression. A new era had arrived, and no one could stop it. Clearly, these events did not go unnoticed by leaders throughout the communist government in China. Whether a hardliner, reformer, or something in between, China's communist leaders were in agreement on one thing. They were determined not to repeat the mistakes of the Soviet Union, which had spent 20% of its GDP on the military-industrial complex. They also did not want to see an internal collapse of the mainland with its 56 ethnic groups. Although Deng Xiaoping had lost influence and resigned from office in the aftermath of Tiananmen Square, as an astute politician he still remained a powerful figure behind the scene within the Chinese government. With global events moving in his favor and supporting his ideals for market reforms, Deng began to reassert his market reform agenda. In the spring of 1992, he conducted a southern tour of China, visiting Guangzhou, Shenzhen, and Zhuhai, and spending the new year in Shanghai. This tour, which ultimately became a major turning point in China's political struggle over market reforms, was designed to give support to the need for further economic reforms. Deng criticized the hardliners that had gained power following the Tiananmen Square affair and praised the efforts and successes of Chinese entrepreneurship. In observing the collapse of the Soviet Union and the strengthening position of market-driven forces in the global economy, provincial governors in various regions began to support the ideals of Deng Xiaoping. The Chinese Politburo in Beijing eventually bowed to the historic forces of change and began to support Deng Xiaoping and his economic revolution. This would be Deng's crowning victory in his long and turbulent struggle to build a market-driven socialist economy. From that point in 1992 and Deng Xiaoping's declaration that the Chinese should get rich gloriously, economic growth and prosperity took off in a gigantic burst of activities in a million different directions. This set in motion an enormous surge in entrepreneurial developments throughout China, as well as the international drive to invest in the largest developing economy on Earth. Major investment firms and global corporations who had been waiting patiently for over 2 years for a clear direction in China's market reform policies reestablished their excitement about the potential opportunities to operate in such an enormous economy with cheap labor costs and a large consumer market. The massive migrations to the cities that began with the opening of the first economic zones in 1979 intensified as millions of peasants continued the march to leave the rural areas for the new urban centers. In fact, since the 1980s, more than 100 million peasants left the countryside to join the economic revolution, the largest migration in modern history. Since the start of the economic reforms, within a 25-year period, over 200 million people were lifted out of poverty. By 1994, China's economy had been growing at a phenomenal rate of 10% per year, and by the end of 2003, China had the largest pool of entrepreneurs, engineers, and business experts in Asia. This country was clearly on a mission to break through the barriers and operate on par with the other great economic powers in the world. Thus, the mandate of heaven was being fulfilled according to China's ancient philosophical beliefs in a ruler's position to fulfill the destiny of the nation and its people. China and the World Trade Organization, WTO. After 15 years of struggle to become a member of the World Trade Organization, WTO, mainland China's membership was officially confirmed at a trade ministers' meeting November 9th through the 13th, 2001 in Doha, Qatar. China's entry into the World Trade Organization at a time when the global economy was slipping into a deepening recession proved to be a crucial factor in global economics, with the two leading economies in the world, America and Japan, mired in economic contraction. A new economic global development was clearly welcomed. Given China's huge potential buying power of 1.3 billion people, entrepreneurial culture, its incorporation of Hong Kong and Macau, and its stated ambition to become a true economic superpower in the 21st century, this massive undertaking to move a former communist mixed-economy country firmly into the free enterprise system represented another major turning point in world history. And again, it must be noted that the information age revolution played a major role in helping to bring about this incredible historic development. Like the developments of the ECC and the one currency movement in Europe, China had been preparing for this event for a long time. Neither the government nor its highly motivated entrepreneurial class was likely to move slowly to seize market shares and consolidate interests on a global scale. This was prime time for China and its people, and it would ultimately bring about a huge impact in the global economy. For instance, as business failures, plant closings, and job cutbacks steadily increased throughout the U.S. in 2001, Chinese companies were active in mergers and acquisitions of various types of American firms, particularly in the high-tech arena. The economic slowdown in America presented some real bargains for Chinese entrepreneurs. The acquisitions accelerated in 2002, benefiting the American economy in the long run as major American corporations were rushing to set up offices and factories in China to participate in the new, friendly environment in the mainland. There were tremendous incentives to move quickly and effectively into these new uncharted waters. Many Chinese companies were compelled to build a strong corporate presence in the high-tech world of the information age. California's export markets in farm foods, high-tech products and services, entertainment products, and financial services experienced a significant boom in trade with China. As history has shown, China's entry into the WTO was not a lightweight event. Economic miracle. China is now viewed as a dominant global power and major economic force in today's world. We are witnessing a major tectonic shift in global affairs. The sheer magnitude and scope of China's power is being felt on many levels and economic fronts: currencies, commodities, the wholesale and retail price of goods sold, to name a few penetrated areas. In the second quarter of 2011, China became the second largest economy in the world, taking the spot held by Japan for much of the past 4 decades. While Japan's economy had been stagnating for more than a decade, China's economy had been in high gear and growing at 9 to 10% per year. In fact, by 2012, China had maintained for over 30 years a growth rate of 9 to 10% per year. In 30 years of massive growth, China managed to accumulate $3.2 trillion in foreign reserves, the largest level of reserves held by any nation in the world. It is now the world's biggest exporter and has the largest market for passenger vehicles. Auto sales exceeded 18 million units for the years 2010 and 2011, 1/4 of the world's production. By the first quarter of 2012, General Motors had 2,900 auto dealerships in China and was planning to open shop in 600 more locations. Not to be left behind, Ford was planning to invest $5 billion in China and produce 15 new vehicles for the Chinese market by 2015. These are major commitments and clearly indicate expectations that China's market for automobiles is going to literally explode to massive levels. Before all of these developments take place, the central planners of China should mandate that new automobile production not be based on the old 20th century combustion engine technology. China should be the first major country in the world to avoid the production of combustion engine automobiles. I will have more to say on this issue in Chapter 10 on peak oil. Major corporations are making more aggressive moves to be a part of the China economic experience. General Motors, Siemens, Caterpillar, General Electric, and others are setting up shop and, in some cases, research and development centers in China. And because of its massive economic clout, China is determining the price of almost all global commodities. This nation consumes 53% of the world's cement, 48% of the iron ore, and 47% of the coal. In addition, China is now the world's second largest importer of oil, which will continue to have dire consequences in a world already facing potential shortages. In the year 2000, China was using less than 10% of the world's energy. The U.S. was using 25%. By 2015, it's estimated that each nation will be using approximately 18% of the world's energy. In regards to rare earth minerals, China has about 1/3 of the world's deposits. These minerals have unique properties and play a critical role in technological applications ranging from energy-efficient light bulbs to hybrid motors to cell phones and fiber optics. China's use and global distribution of its rare earth deposits have come under political fire in the West and will most likely be a major issue going forward in the 21st century. The rare earth affair is a vivid example of how nations will be struggling over limited, finite, and depleting resources in the years ahead. There simply will not be enough natural resources to feed the voracious appetites of governments and global corporations seeking to dominate their respective fields, regions, and territories. In response to China's grip on rare earth deposits, in April 2012, Japan signed an agreement with Kazakhstan to develop these critical metals from new mining operations in this Central Asian nation. The special news announcement signaled a strategic move by Japan to break free of the higher prices imposed by China. Japan's Trade Minister Yukio Idano will meet Kazakh government officials, including President Nursultan Nazarbayev, to sign the agreement in early May, making way for Sumitomo Corporation, Japan Oil, Gas and Metals National Corp., and Kazatomprom to partner in rare earth extraction. China is building everything on a massive scale: skyscrapers, train stations, airports, and entire cities. Analysts report that the Chinese are building a new ship every 2 weeks and 10 new cities a year. This nation now has over 118 megacities with populations exceeding over 1 million people. Foreign architects have been involved in these developments since the late 1990s. China's urban planners estimate that 300 million of its people will be moving to urban areas over the next 15 years. The Pearl River Delta was one of the first Chinese regions to open to foreign business in the 1980s and is now a rich, giant manufacturing hub. According to the 2010 census, the growth of major metropolitan areas had been phenomenal, with a huge population growth. By 2010, Shanghai had a population of 23 million people, Beijing, 20 million, Chengdu, 14 million, Guangzhou, 13 million, and the Chongqing metropolitan area, 29 million. Cheap migrant workers formed the base of the huge worker revolution. In the early to mid stages of the economic reforms, many workers lived in dormitory conditions, and many still do, working for as little as 60 cents an hour, 12 hours a day, with weekends off. In the early 2000s, an ordinary line worker employed in a factory making Nike shoes could make $165 to $250 per month, working 8 hours a day, 5 days a week. The hourly rate for that job translates to $1.03 to $1.56 per hour, and this was clearly one of the better paying jobs available in the job market. Other jobs were not so generous. Depending on the industry and the company, hourly wages descended to levels as low as 25 cents per hour. If the manufacturer had hired an American worker doing the same job, the hourly wage would have been $13. Some workers are required to work 6 days per week and will make only 50 cents to 60 cents per hour. This is the primary reason why outsourcing and offshoring became a huge business model for American and other international corporations seeking to lower their labor costs. This is also the primary reason why China quickly became the manufacturing hub of the world. Between 500 million and 750 million Chinese still live in rural poverty, so the economic revolution is still very much in the making. China is working hard to manage the physical shift per year of 15 to 20 million people from the countryside to urban areas. This is by far an enormous undertaking for any government. The Ant Tribe, a term that was coined by Lian Si, a professor at the University of International Business in Beijing, who wrote a book with that title, is the name given to millions of educated young people who live in heavily crowded slum-like conditions on the outskirts of major metropolitan cities. This is the generation born after 1980 and are considered the most privileged generation in China's long history. The rapid transformation, technological shift, and prosperity of China are practically all this generation has experienced. In their lifetime, China is emerging as a superpower on the world's stage, and this historic development has deeply motivated and encouraged this generation to push for the highest levels of achievement. They are making whatever sacrifices that are necessary in order to achieve their goals in life, for they know that this is the time of China's ascent in modern global civilization. The insatiable desire for education in China is globally recognized, and its students are now rated number 1 in the world. With the exception of India, China's monumental march to modernization for the majority of its people is a massive undertaking for one country, unlike any economic development in world history. The circle of trade and investments between China and America, the world's 2 largest economies, is crucial. China's economic growth is exposed to enormous risk of being derailed by economic collapse in the West. This was readily observed in the 2008 meltdown in America when, by December 2008, over 23 million Chinese workers had lost their jobs. Dozens of toy and textile companies were hit hard with the slowdown. In the wake of the 2008 credit crunch, when consumer demand from the U.S. went into a rapid downturn, China implemented a massive stimulus program in order to keep the nation moving forward despite the massive slowdown. Designed to encourage growth and domestic consumption, the $586 billion, 4 trillion yuan, stimulus package was focused on 10 key areas of the economy: transportation, environment, health and education, housing, rural infrastructure, industry, disaster rebuilding, taxes, incomes, and finance. That effort was critical and kept the world from free-falling into economic chaos. Worldwide, well over 30 million people lost their jobs during the worst economic calamity since the Great Depression of the 1930s. China's real estate bubble, myth or reality? In response to the 2008 meltdown, China implemented easy money policies to stimulate its economy. The world relied on China as a source of growth during the weak recovery period of 2009 through 2012, according to a report entitled Household Registration and Migrant Labor in China. 23 million rural migrant workers lost their jobs in the wake of the 2008-2009 meltdown in America. The export industries were hardest hit and suffered immediate economic fallout from America. The report tells us that, in the early months of the crisis, late 2008, high levels of unemployment among migrant laborers in the Pearl River Delta, combined with claims for wage arrears and severance pay, triggered mass protests, and angry laid-off workers clashed with riot police. The increasing number of second-generation migrant workers, more educated and rights-conscious than their parents, may be less tolerant of abuses and injustices and readier to defend their interests when badly treated. Trillions of dollars in cheap credit was released by the communist government to help stem the tide of unrest and civil disturbance. However, much of the excess cash flowed into pumping up China's real estate markets. Economic data suggests that real estate investments increased dramatically after 2008, a direct result of the stimulus program initiated by the Chinese government to counter the impact of the global recession. A clear indication of the impact is what occurred in 2009. New construction projects increased across the board throughout China. Large-scale urbanization and rapidly rising incomes was the justification for the extraordinary boom period. In an ironic twist of fate, the economic catastrophe that finally sunk the U.S. economy in 2008 took root and was adopted in China's real estate markets. In the 4 years after 2008, the real estate bubble mentality worked its way into China's economic system. During those critical years, 2009 through 2012, when China maintained stability in the global economy, a housing and commercial property development boom swept throughout mainland China. This nation built around 1 billion square meters of housing per year during the global recovery period. For Chinese investors, the returns in other investment categories simply did not compare with the much higher returns in real estate. After the breakneck speed of decades of building and market-driven real estate values, by 2010, 64 million homes and apartments were sitting vacant for 6 months or more, with no apparent buyers or families who were willing to rent an apartment. Analysts cited 2 key reasons for this phenomenon. 1. Most families in China have no interest in renting an apartment. They would rather own the roof over their heads. This is a very strong preference in China. The Chinese would rather live in a purchased property. 2. For many years, real estate was the investment of choice by Chinese investors looking for strong returns for their savings and a safe haven from the pressures of inflation. Encouraged by the increase in property values in recent periods, rapid growth in the economy, and an investment vehicle less volatile than the stock market, investors viewed real estate developments as great opportunities. Both buyers and developers, builders, were able to take advantage of low interest rate bank loans to purchase land and properties. This was a boom similar to what happened in America. The housing boom generated enormous economic activity in other sectors of the economy. In 2010, the country produced 627 million tons of steel and 1.87 billion tons of cement, 44.3% and 60% of the world's output, respectively. Nearly 43% of the world's construction machinery, such as bulldozers and excavators, were produced in China. Demand for natural resources such as iron ore from Australia and Brazil, copper from Chile, lumber from Russia and Canada, and equipment from Japan, America, and Germany would be affected by a slowdown in housing. Many domestic and international corporations would take a solid hit to their bottom lines. China's conversion to private home ownership in the 1990s and subsequent private ownership property laws in 2004 and 2007 has provided a basis and strong foundation for Chinese investors to store a significant part of their savings in real estate. An in-depth article written in Foreign Affairs, December 2011, sheds light on some very important issues regarding China's real estate bubble and how it was initiated. According to Foreign Affairs, China's leaders engineered a lending boom that expanded the country's money supply by roughly two-thirds. Real estate was already the preferred place for Chinese to stash cash. Now, investors had that much more cash to stash. Prices rose accordingly. In many locations, the cost of prime new properties doubling in just 2 years. Large and small Chinese investors provided the fuel for this bubble. The Foreign Affairs article further explains the strategy of many investors that were focused on long-term gains and appreciation in property values. For more than a decade, they have bet on longer-term demand trends by buying up multiple units, often dozens at a time, which they then leave empty with the belief that prices will rise. Estimates of such idle holdings range anywhere from 10 million to 65 million homes. No one really knows the exact number, but the visual impression created by vast ghost districts filled with row upon row of uninhabited villas and apartment complexes leaves one with a sense of investments with literally nothing inside. Thus, it appears that many of these properties were kept empty by investors due to speculation reasons and as a long-term store of wealth. It is these large construction projects that have played a significant role in helping to fuel the 9 to 10% growth rates over the past 30 years. Thus, manufacturing, supported by strong export demand, and the construction industry, with the building of everything from single-family homes to entire cities, have been the main engines of growth. Therefore, China's growth was not driven, in large part, by domestic demand. A major part of the economic growth of China has been the enormous government-funded infrastructure projects, particularly in real estate developments. As of late 2011, these investments accounted for 49% of Chinese GDP. Many of these projects are sitting empty, and in some cases over 5 years. And many of these construction projects were funded by government-controlled banks with newly printed money. One has to question the wisdom of this strategy, especially in light of what happened to Japan starting in the early 1990s. Japan had a long boom period, see Chapter 5, followed by a devastating bust cycle that lasted over 15 years. Stock market and real estate values descended into a prolonged period of deflation. It's worth noting that during Japan's real estate bubble, housing prices peaked at 3.8 times GDP. In China's housing boom, home values reached 3.5 times GDP in February 2010. Analysts are questioning whether China is on the same path as Japan. Japan experienced decades of growth in an enormous boom and then fell into an enormous deflationary bust period. Similarly, China has experienced decades of enormous growth during an extraordinary boom period and now may be faced with the prospect of a deflationary bust period. In 2012, what we see happening in China is this. 1. Real estate prices have started to fall, and the bubble appears to be deflating. China's Banking Regulatory Commission has ordered domestic banks to weigh the impact of a 30% decline in housing transactions in stress tests aimed at determining the health of the Chinese financial system. With the tightening of credit and restrictions on how many properties can be purchased by potential buyers, discouraging speculation in the real estate market, China's gigantic real estate markets are beginning to unravel. 2. Viewed by the West, the commercial property development in China is extremely overbuilt. Speculative credit will start to leave China as the descent in property values begin in earnest. 3. The massive fiscal stimulus used to build infrastructure may prove in the end to be a massive case of malinvestment, a deadly sin in capitalism. 4. And like Japan, China has pumped more money into its stock and property markets in order to revive the wealth effect for local and domestic consumers. In order to escape the Japanese bust syndrome, China will need to implement a strategy for major domestic consumption in the face of the dynamics of imminent decline in both Europe and America. This is a bubble that is still in the making and is a colossal crisis, even in China, where yearly migrations of millions of people is an ongoing process. This nation also has other peculiar anomalies in its real estate development markets, one being the world's biggest shopping mall, which has been 99% vacant since 2005. Billed as the largest amusement park in Asia, Wonderland is another unfinished construction project in China, situated on 100 acres on a location 45 minutes away from the center of Beijing. Work on this development was stopped more than a decade ago. Farmers were uprooted and displaced in order to make room for this massive development that ultimately went nowhere. In traditional capitalistic economic thinking, these projects represent a bad allocation of resources and funds. China's ghost cities and malls and vacant condo complexes has been the curious fascination of many analysts throughout the world.